We are drawing to a close. So I think today is going to be my last live demo. And I wanted to, show you a little bit about the slip casting process because we've gotten through mold making. And now we should look at using the liquid slip. And then I want to have a couple things to wrap up about the kilns. And then I have some slides from Homer Laughlin, which is a large manufacturing facility in Wheeling, West Virginia. And they do a variety of molded ceramic processes at an extremely large scale. So I thought we should look at that because that's pretty different than anything that we've seen so far. So again, good morning, everybody who's joining us. Thanks for saying hi. It's nice to have you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so I'll try and manage the chat thing, that you know how technology sometimes gets me. So let me just get switched over to a screen share, and then we'll be good to go. Screen one. There we are. Okay. And let's see what we got going on over here. I'm going to go ahead and pop my chat box open. I almost have got this, you guys. It's now that the semester's over, I think I've almost got this. Okay. Good morning. We are going to finish up a few things about the kiln talk. I'll try and go quickly through that. And then, yeah. Homer Laughlin and slip casting. But because actually, I'm going to stop sharing just for a second. I'm so close, you guys. We have time sensitive stuff to do today. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was slip casting. So I thought while the presentation was going, we could go ahead and fill one mold. So this is a one piece slip cast bowl mold. And I just want to fill it with the liquid slip, and then it has to sit, you know, for, at least 45 minutes or so for it to be the right thickness. So we're just going to do that now, and then that way at the end of the class we can pour it out. So in the studio we keep a bucket of liquid slip, and normally I have like a big scoop that I'll scoop out and then pour into the mold. But because I'm in my dining room, I'm trying to use less equipment. And so I'm gonna just pour the slip from the bucket into the mold. So this should also be exciting, but maybe slightly less messy. So it's like pancake batter, but maybe a little bit thinner. And you want to have a level surface that you're pouring on, and the surface of your mold has to be level, or you could at least only fill up the slip to the lowest point in the lip. So we're gonna just hold off on that for a little while, set that off to the side, and we'll empty it when it's the right thickness. So were you able to see that? Do you have any questions about that? I can see your chat right now. And you are welcome to actually turn on your volume and talk to me if you'd like to. All right, back to screen sharing. Here we are back in Norway. So we were talking about kilns. And I just wanted to show you a few different types of kind of experimental kilns. We were looking at very functional kilns last time. And so I had the opportunity to go to Norway as a visiting scholar some years ago. And this is just a couple architecture pictures from Norway. These are called stebbers. They're little tiny storage houses. They're adorable. This is a stave church. So giant, maybe, certainly rebuilt, but probably originally 1,000 years old. And the whole reason to go was to build these kilns. This is a close-up of the Sabor. It was gorgeous. I like patterns. That should probably be obvious by now. But I got interested in kiln building, and I got an opportunity to go there and just try and do something kind of crazy. And so I researched all sorts of different types of kilns that could be hand built. And so this is like a basket, and it has this clay material put on the outside of it, and then it's a little tiny wood kiln. And so I started looking up plans for these kilns, like how to build maybe groundhog kilns, we talked about last time, and how it might build a framework for a kiln using branches and twigs and things like that, basically sewing like a giant basket. And I thought, if these guys can make a giant dragon, I could make a kiln too. So this is like a big giant dragon kiln. You can kind of see the basket, like the sticks tied together, and the newspaper kind of as a surface that the clay is being built up on there. So I tried that. This is my basket, woven out of sticks I found around the area. And I tried to cover it in clay. And this was a crazy disaster, but very interesting experience. I quickly went back to just firing pots in a hole and seeing what would happen with that. And remember, whenever you introduce wood, you never really know exactly what's going to happen to the surface of the pot. So you can see some smoke effects on them. And then I built a paper kiln based off this research, where you're layering paper and clay. So the kiln only lasts one time, but essentially I built like this wire framework covered in paper and layers of clay. You can see I just built it around the pots that I wanted to fire, and then fired a wood fire underneath it, and got it to deposit ash on the surface of pots, and then added a little methylene cyanide to make them glossy. And so I just wanted to show, these pots are interesting. It's the beginning of some pattern work that still sticks with me right now, but these are jars with slip and underglaze painted on the outside. And then that's the raw clay colored with just a little bit of methylene cyanide on the surface to make them glossy. And this is the landscapes from around Norway that I was looking at while I was trying to put these pieces together. I think that this tiny little moss is going to show up in a screen print really soon. I've been trying for, this makes maybe 8 years, I've been trying to figure out how to use this pattern in my pots, and it first started out as painting. So there's a lot of really weird types of kilns. People build huge kilns. This is a huge beehive kiln. It's big enough to go inside of. So basically it's a building that's fired in place. And they had built, like had ceramic fiber and metal surrounding it when they fired it as like a raw clay piece. So people build kilns not only to be functional, but also as sculptural pieces. So of course, there are places on the planet where people will make earthen homes and set them on fire, and they will like harden in place. Basically, you repair them year after year if it rains. But this is like a art installation where this woman built this clay sculpture, and then part of the installation was it being lit on fire. And then that's like ceramic fiber all around it. And then that gets peeled off, and then you have this like permanent sculpture in place. Some of them are performance pieces. So calculating how much paper you would need to get to the temperature that you want to, and building this huge hanging structure is meant to be fired once and to be enjoyed like a giant party. Some odd sculptures, like a boat kiln, basically, really looking at installation art in kind of a weird way. It's hard to talk about art that's about decay and try and get people to like it, but that's what's going on here. This is a car kiln, if you get it, car kiln. We talked about car kilns. Like you put all these ceramic pieces inside of the car and lit it on fire. It's kind of disturbing. Art's not necessarily meant to make you feel great. Ice kiln. So this is interesting, a kiln fired in a giant block of ice. So bizarre. People do a lot of really bizarre things with ceramics. All right, the last one I just wanted to show you, run through. This is, I think, where we I might have said just a little bit about the kiln that I'm firing here, the gas kiln. I just wanted to show you that was ground up, starting with making the kiln shed. Hey, Evan says he's not seeing the slides. Is it coming okay across for everybody else? Are you seeing the screen share? You can say yes or no.
Yes.
Okay. So this was you know, building a building from the ground up was, it was exciting for me, and it involved a lot of concrete, leveling out the space and having it thick enough to support the weight of the chimney. And I got a lot of help from family to put this together. So this shed was basically meant for the kiln. You can see the hole for the chimney up top. And then once we had this building, my husband built a climbing wall on the other side of it. So if you ever visit, bring your climbing shoes. This is the kiln going up. So this is like the back for the chimney and the floor of the kiln. And then just the walls going up. So again, this is a loose brick construction with the hard bricks on bottom and the soft bricks on top. They're a better thermal insulator, but the hard bricks you need to be steady. I built this with a buddy. Buddies are nice. Remember, like with plaster, everybody needs a buddy. This is my friend Meg. She's putting the arch bricks on top so you can see our wooden form, and putting the arch bricks on top and the cast iron around the edges, kind of holding the arch in place. And the finished kiln, we've had the door arch in, and we're getting ready to take that wooden arch out of the center of the kiln. And this is in the inside looking up inside of the arch when it's finished. So you can see there's no mortar or anything. That's all pressure that's holding that in, keystone brick. So it was a very fun experience. There's actually 2 layers, so there's another layer of fiber on top of that. And this is me and my friend Meg when we were like super young. I had no gray hair and we had the best dogs. Yeah, kiln shed. So come visit Shimmy. One day we'll have a pottery party here. This is looking inside of it, so you can see the 2 shelves deep. So there's a whole stack in back, and then you start again and stack in front. That's why it takes so many pots to fill the kiln. Here Meg is lighting it. So there's 4 burners. You control the oxygen in a couple different places. It's pretty exciting. And then I showed you this one. This is when it gets super hot. And just a little view of what it looks like before and after. So on the left, just a reminder, when you put the glazes on your pots, they will not look like what they look like when they come out of the kiln. There may be some similarities, but some of them can look radically different. And then you can probably also see the cones. Those are the little tiny sticks that are brightly colored on the left and melted over in white on the right. Okay. End of kilns. Any questions about kilns before we move on? We kind of had to end quickly last time. So I'm going to pause there just for 1 second before I move on to Homer Laughlin. And my slip cast is doing fine, but it's barely started, so it's not time to pour it out yet. Homer Laughlin is one of the largest manufacturers of ceramics left in the United States. There used to be hundreds of companies, especially in the West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania areas because of the natural deposits of clay, and so there were very many companies until probably globalization really hit, and then the need for American-made ceramics was reduced because of imported ceramics. Okay. So we will go to Homer Laughlin, and I'll just rest here on Fiesta because Fiesta ware is something that you might have been familiar with. But I have 2 questions about kilns. One, is it potentially hazardous to have a wooden structure around a kiln? Yes, they catch on fire. You have to be careful. There's a certain distance that you want to have, like the framing around your chimney needs to be, you know, I would say no less than 6 inches and hopefully like a foot away from the actual ceramic brick. It's not super hot up there, but you would definitely not touch the outside of the kiln. Like you would not hug the outside of that kiln when it's on, even with the soft brick that's pretty reflective in temperature. So yes, people do catch their sheds on fire. It does happen. but the kiln would deteriorate. If it was just like out in the rain, it would deteriorate. And so you take a chance. Hear you correctly earlier, there was a kiln inside of ice or something. Yes, temporarily. Like they built the interior chamber out of giant ice blocks and then heated it. And it just took so long for the ice to melt that they, in theory, could have fire pots inside of it. But, you know, I'm not going to go with the practicality of what's happening to the melting water. Don't ask me. How much propane would you go through in a firing? I don't remember the number of gallons, but I remember it costed me about $150 a firing. And it cost, I'm trying to think how many dollars to fill the 500-gallon tank. $600, $700 probably. So maybe a quarter of a tank to fire. So the Homer Laughlin makes industrial china, like dinnerware for restaurants and hotels. And of course, Fiestaware was their original line, Art Deco. And they make more modern pots as well, but it's still all pretty much industrial china, which is the volume that they're working at. When you can visit this location in Wheeling, West Virginia, and so it's pretty close to Pittsburgh, like 45 minutes out of Pittsburgh. And they have a wonderful showroom and history center, and there is open tours to the factory. And so we did that, but then we got to add, oh, I forgot to mention I took students here. We got to add visiting the design department and then going into the historical section of the factory, which is not normally open to the public. So they had, it was a pretty interesting place. It was very industrial. This is one of the older factory buildings, some old molds. Parts of it felt very decayed, and parts of it were amazingly technology advanced, the way that they're making ceramics. But it was a quiet place to visit. So starting off with clay processing in a giant facility, these are huge silos of dry and raw materials. They're purchased as individual materials so that the company can make its own clay body. So these are all raw materials, and then they would be put into giant hoppers. So these are giant ball mills. They have huge steel balls in them. And so that's like the size of a person, and it's rolling and crushing the clay to make it all really small homogeneous particles. That's especially important for the liquid clay, which needs to be very smooth and have no lumps. All of those raw materials are fed into a hopper system that's computer controlled for volume and rate of flow and rate of mixture and all of these things. You've never seen people so excited to look into a machine. That's all of the students taking pictures down into what is probably just a hole full of clay. It's a giant, giant facility. And so they're mixing their clay, and then they have to, they put it into two different processes to turn it into liquid clay and to plastic clay. So the first thing that happens is they mix the raw materials together, get it wet, and then they press it into these patties. So what you're seeing here are these really large machines that press these patties of clay just after it's been mixed. And then this is in between sheets. So they kind of squirt it on those sheets, and then they compress it with pressure to squeeze out the moisture. And then those clay pieces pop off, and they're put onto a conveyor belt and then dropped into a pug mill and churned up again to be mixed. And then this is all turned into, sometimes it is turned into liquid clay. And so this is, that clay has been like dried out, flaked back down, which means water added to it to where all the particles separate. And then it's being screened into a giant vat that it transports the liquid clay to other parts of the factory. So yeah, And those same pressed sheets, similar press sheets, can also be turned into plastic clay through pug mills. Get my mouse in the right spot. And so a pug mill is going to help you de-air the clay. So it's a giant auger that's running, and it's de-airing the clay, and it's making the moisture content all of the same. And then it shoots off in these logs. If you can look at the end of that machine, there are different dies, like different circle sizes for the extrusion, and those relate to the machines that they're going to go to. So those little tiny plugs would then be sliced up and dropped into a cup maker, where the larger end for the extrusion, those would go to a plate machine. So that as you're cutting them off, the diameter of that solid block is proportional to the mold it's about to drop into. So all the clay that happens in the factory, if it has not been fired, it can be recycled. So they collect these giant vats of them, and then it can be re-moistened and put back into the process. But if it's been fired, it's toast. This is the most enormous. You can't really tell the scale of this. You can see the cars in the background, but this is like their trash pile outside of the factory. So once it's been fired, they can't reclaim it. And they don't really, you can't, it's like industrial waste. You can't really take it to like a landfill. They have their own one. And it's like a mountain of fired pieces. Very bizarre. So clay is a prep. You have liquid clay, plastic clay. Both of these materials are put into molds. So there's a master mold shop. This is like a wheel where you would make plaster molds, casting liquid plaster and then turning it like it's a wood lathe. This is like plaster handles. So starting with a solid block of plaster and drawing on it like you would a block of wood that you're about to take to a bandsaw, and then cutting out the different shapes and sanding it down. So this is how they're getting to their different mold forms. This is a polyurethane mold. So this is something that would have been CNC'd from a computer file. And then this is making the plaster mold. So this is like a master positive to make many molds off of. Once you have those plaster positives, most of the molds in a facility like this are going to have a special air system put inside of them. So this is actually in the mold shop. You can see they have these giant steel rings. Those things are to help the molds be moved around from machine to machine. But they have a giant plaster shop that's making molds constantly. And this is the guy pouring like a huge vat of plaster into the different molds. Inside of the molds have these air tubes. So maybe you can see this like metal mesh and then this white tube that runs around in a spiral. That's actually embedded inside of the mold because they blow air into the mold during the processes to release the clay. And so that's actually strung inside of the mold frame before the plaster is put in. And this is it. At that scale, the plaster is pretty steamy. Do you remember that it gets hot? So this plaster gets so hot that it gets steamy in the studio. So liquid clay. So that was processing clay and making molds. So now I'm about to talk about slip casting. So I'll just pause for a second if you guys have any questions. This is the traditional Fiestaware side of the factory that's not open to the public. So all of these molds are filled with liquid clay and then popped out. So they'll have a giant tube attached to the ceiling that's connected to those slip vats, and they run down the rows and they just fill up mold after mold after mold with them. This is looking inside of one of the cup molds. It has a foot cast in place and a handle cast in place. So maybe you can see on the bottom that inset that makes the biscuit inside of the mold, and the handle is really nice And then, so that would be a pretty typical production run for an afternoon, however many hundreds of cups that is. So this is some little salt and pepper shakers. So they're cast and they have that texture completely cast in there, but to get those holes in them, once the clay stiffens up, this woman is using a drill press to create all of the holes inside of that. And then usually they're wiped off or blown off to kind of clean off the trimmings. Here you can see, this is like a handle mold. So there's a bunch of handles with that sprue hole. So the clay goes in the top and then you break those handles off. So a lot of times there's a ton of handwork still, even in a huge industrial facility like this. So you saw one mold where the handles were cast in place, but many of them are cast separately, and then you would be attaching those handles right onto the surface. Somebody's doing that for, 8 or 10 hours a day. Inside the slip casting room, you can see the big hoses, the big red hose in the back is the slip. That's the pipe to the slip. And then all of the yellow hoses are air hoses to help clean out all of the pots. So walking around and kind of blowing them off. Each one has to be cleaned up. So imagine if it has a mold, a part line, then maybe you can see the part line on those pictures. And each one of those things has to be scraped off by hand. There's no machine that does that for those slip cast pieces. So the Fiesta Ware line is really beautiful. They make it today, and people get crazy about what colors come out. This guy is cleaning up the bottom. Every single foot is scraped with a knife to clean it up, to soften it, to keep it from scratching your table. Okay, so that was slip casting, pouring liquid sip in, pour liquid sip it out, and then cleaning up the pots. That's what we're doing here today in the demo. I want to talk to you a little bit about pressware. So this is like our drape molds, but with hydraulic press, you can mold both sides of these forms, and press molding is nice and molding is nice because you can get forms you can't get off of a wheel, so they don't have to be in the round. I wish this video worked. I don't think it will, but this is a two-sided mold. If you can see my mouse, he's about to drop clay on that center piece, and then this top piece is going to drop down into it, and it will squeeze the plate between, and then the trimmings pop off. Press molding can also happen with machines like jiggering or jollying. So what happens is this machine comes down and presses the clay around objects. So there's a rotating component that makes roundware. So plates, because they're wide and flat, would be squished, but something that's like a bowl that has the sides like a vessel, you might need a little bit of help getting it up that edge. And so these would have be pressed into a round mold. And this is what one of those machines looks like. It has two tracks on it. You maybe can see the white discs, which are the molds themselves. And that huge box in front is actually where the trimmings like fly off of this machine. So there is a silver bulb that is being pressed down into that mold, and it pushes the clay up against the wall. And then maybe you see one lever arm. And what happens is as the clay comes up the wall and there's extra clay, that is a knife, and it slices it off and it shoots it off like a ribbon off into space. Yeah, into that giant box, really, and then it's collected. So remember, anything that's probably round has been made in one of those jigger or jolly molds, and then things like this, like handles, those are all added later. Somebody is sticking each one of those on. So this is what those handle molds would look like, rows and rows and rows of them, and then that big red tube is the slip tube. You're filling them up, and then this guy is popping them off of the sprue, cutting them off of that centerpiece, which can be reclaimed, and then putting them onto the mugs, each one with a little bit of slip. And then it's cleaned up around the edge and set off to the side. So the clay is very forgiving in that it doesn't pop off. If you were to do that with a porcelain handle in your studio, it would come off in a heartbeat. Here those cups are drying and they have the emblem of Homer Laughlin stamped into the bottom. So there you can see those handles coming off. So he's scraping each one clean, the part line, cutting them off, and then sticking them onto the handle. Okay. So that happens at a really large scale. So this is kind of a plate one. These machines, it's kind of hard to tell, but again, it's this big silver ball that's pressing down into the mold and spreading the clay out. And then you're kind of trimming off the side. So this is those bowls that we saw before. All that, what looks like a flat rim, is actually going to dry and crack off. And the bowl is that center part that has the nice little rolled edge. So they get made in one area, they fly up into the ceiling and go through a dryer and then come out the other side. And then this guy is determining whether or not they have been successfully made. So he's knocking off all the extra trimmings. He's putting the good bowls onto a round conveyor belt next to him that has a sponge that will clean off the rim. And then if they're bad, then he puts them in the trash. So this machine has little suction cups, and it comes down and it will suction cup your bowl and pick it up and move it to the next part of the machine. When it's on its little stand, it spins one direction and there's a roller that goes over the top and then a roller that goes over the side, all cleaning those up. And then the suction cups pick them up and then it stacks them on these boards, probably like 3 or 4 tall. And then those boards get moved on into a drying system. So they're dried. So here you can see, this is just like what it would be like walking through the factory where plates and molds are going from one space to another on these like ceiling conveyor belts. These are all the plates kind of stacked up probably. Those look like they're on kiln shelves, so they're dry and they're ready to go. Again, just where, I mean, they're making thousands of these things a day. It's fascinating. This is pretty typical, this like 4 or 5 tall when they're drying. That's something you'd want to do even in your own kiln. I never stack plates more than 4 or 5 because the weight of them can cause the bottom ones to crack. So you have to be careful with your materials as you're moving them around. I think this guy, he must be cleaning them from getting glazed. So yeah, let's look at a few glazing pictures. So most of these pots, especially the colored ones, are once fired. They get bone dry and then they get sprayed with the glaze. This looks like the plate's kind of getting cleaned off around the edge. So you can see rollers in different directions, and then the conveyor belts that are like picking them up with the suction cups and dropping them off to the side. Incredible amount of machinery. These are, you can tell with the holes on the bottom of these the shelves that those are drying racks, so the air can come up from the bottom. So there's so many conveyor belts. They have these little like stairs that you can like, so you end up walking over lines of materials rolling by. When they're fired, each one of them gets its own little like biscuit so that it won't warp or change shape. These are all the cups and bowls getting ready to be glazed. So this is looking inside of a plate sprayer. So you put a plate on each one of those round rings and then it spins and you're spraying glaze at it. And the sprayers are coming from different directions. Here you can see it kind of going through the bowls. It's so insane that these people aren't wearing face masks because this is like an open air environment. This is the one that I think we saw the other day, this red. Getting sprayed onto the bowls. So sprayers in different directions. They can collect all the glaze in the back and reuse it. So plastic clay is really easy to reclaim. And the glaze you can too. You can add moisture back to it. Here are some of the cone packs. Remember we talked about cones the other day. So these are sticks of clay that mark different temperatures. And so they use very many of them throughout their kilns to kind of keep track. This is their giant car kiln. So this is what it looks like. From one side of it, you can see that looks like plate racks to me. It looks like 4 or 5 high plate racks rolling into the kiln, and then you can see into the depths of it, completely red hot. So this factory runs 24/7, mostly because turning this kiln on and off is cost prohibitive. So they can slow down the production line is easier than like rebooting because of how long it takes to heat back up to that core temperature. Once the plates are done, this is actually a fracture test. So this machine is on a like a pendulum, and it's lifted up, and then it drops and it hits the plate. And this is the way that they check whether or not the pots are being fired to the right temperature, whether or not the clay body needs to be adjusted for strength, and also the strength of the glazes themselves. So they do a lot of like impact testing for their work. And then when you talk about decoration, so most of their pots are once fired, but they do a lot of custom designs for hotels and restaurants that would want like specialty emblems or colors or some like a custom order. And so this guy is painting stripes. He's a circle painter. So he's that the wheel is spinning. And you can see how long and big his brush is, but then it comes to that teeny little point. So this is what I'm saying about different brushes provide different types of line when you're decorating. The benefit of that brush is that there's so many bristles, it holds a lot of material, but the point is really fine. So you can draw that line and it draws the material out of the brush slowly. And so that's nice. It's nice because you don't want to paint like halfway around the plate and then have to dip your brush back in the paint and then put it back on the surface. So some of the students got to try and realize how hard it is. So a lot of this stuff is getting painted like over glaze. Remember how we talked about decoration be under, in, or on top of a glaze? So a lot of these things, this is like fired clear glaze. They're putting over glaze on it, and then it goes back in the kiln. Here he's striping the top of a cup. So he's putting that little color stripe. You can tell that it's already glazed because of how glossy it is. That stamp that's on the bottom happens in that first firing. So this lady is putting on decals. So this is similar to what Stacy was doing. I think we only saw Stacy put on her vinyl. I'm not sure we actually saw her do an image transfer. So this is the decal paper. They print it there with a 4 ink color printing process. They can make their own, but essentially it's like this little plastic sheet. It's like a temporary tattoo that's what you should imagine in your mind. Because you're putting it on that surface and you're adding water and you're pressing it down, and then it's transferring some of that image on there. And sometimes there is a cellulose film that's left on the surface, and that burns off. So here she's putting that rose picture right on the surface, and then she's using that plastic card to seal it down. So you use water to kind of slide it off the transfer paper, and then you use that thing to really seal it down, remove all the water and get out all the air bubbles, so the image fires right on the surface of the pot. This one is interesting. This is industrial screen printing for the ceramics. So she is holding a plate and she's putting it into a little frame, and then that metal ring above it is actually a screen, a silk screen, and then that gets pressed down on the plate. And then there's a rib that is the shape of the plate or the bowl. So it can be round, like it could be really pretty shaped on the inside. And it pushes the screen with such pressure that it stretches the shape to the piece. So even if the piece is curved, like right now, like when I screen print, you see me, I have to do it on a flat surface. But this has a screen that's stretchy enough that it bends and curves to that surface. So you can get it on things that aren't flat. So there you go. That's 2-color printing process. You can see that the black has been screen printed, and then whatever it looks like seas or some little ocean waves or something like that. So those are overglaze, and then overglaze gets fired again. So this is much smaller production runs. Remember, we're talking about this being their custom work, but it's still a long conveyor belt kiln, kind of like in an annealing kiln because it goes to such a much lower temperature than the glaze itself. But it's just enough to heat up the surface and to heat up the decal itself, and then it goes in. This is a fresh showroom of their historical work. And you can see the luster. I'm not sure if I have a picture of anybody painting on the luster, but the luster, that gold luster, silver, or platinum can come on through a screen, or all of that banding is hand painted. There's like little ladies there spinning the plates and gold banding every single edge of every single one of those plates. And then the post-production, their storage facility was fascinating and enormous. So, I mean, this whole warehouse just full of finished pottery, ready for packaging and shipment. Pretty beautiful colors. And they also have a really wonderful, I don't think I have any pictures from inside of it, but they have a really wonderful shop of seconds and stuff like that. So it's worth a visit if you're in the greater Pittsburgh area. Okay, I think that was it. We'll stop right there for just a second. So that was Homer Laughlin. That was slip casting, breast molding, tons of industrial processes. So I'm wondering if you have any questions about that. So the gold banding, a type of glaze, yeah, it's called a luster. It's a low fire material, and it is painted on. It comes in teeny, teeny, tiny jars because it actually has gold in it, and it is horrifically expensive, like crazy expensive. Little tiny jars for like $50 or something like that. Any other questions about that before we do just a little bit of demoing? Let's see, my mold is just about ready here to dump out. Are we doing okay today, people? So a couple of things. I want to show you how to get the liquid slip out, how to get a piece out, and how to clean it up. So we're going to go ahead and do this. I think that this is thick enough. So how do you know when it's thick enough? One, you're going to time your pieces. So it does change if your mold is a different temperature. I mean, a different moisture content. Like if I use my mold day after day, then sometimes it can take longer. But once you get to a thickness that you like, you should note how much time that takes. And then that way, the next time you come back, you set an alarm on your phone, and then you come back to it the same amount of time. In theory, it should be the same thickness. If you forget about it, it will be crazy thick. And so it's good to, like I said, maybe set a little reminder that this is something that you need to do. So I'm going to lift this bucket back up on the table. Sorry if my head's getting cut off. I am going to pour this back into here. And I'm going to let it sit here for a second and drip out. So there's it's just a little tiny strips. So you think, oh, it's not too much. But if that pours back into your bowl, then it collects on the bottom and you get a big lump. I once saw a student put sticks across here and turn his mold upside down, and then he was letting it all drip out. I don't normally do upside down because I don't like having drip marks from multiple places. It's just more to clean up. But he left it and walked away, and then he came back and he's like, oh my gosh, what happened to my piece? Well, it dried so fast, it shrunk away from the mold, and then it fell off back down into the bucket. So don't leave your piece like this, but just for a minute to get those drips off. Right. When it stops, definitely there can be no continuous stream, but maybe just 1 or 2 drips like every 10 seconds or something like that, then you know you have enough out. It's important to keep your slip bucket pretty clean. If the inside of it gets kind of gross and dried slip, then that falls off into your pots. When you are done pouring it out, there's this lip or tongue of clay that's coming out over the side of the mold. And I use a plastic rib to scrape off the surface and get rid of that extra clay. Because if you leave it there, the clay that it's thinner than the clay that's in the bowl, it will dry faster because it's on the surface, and it will start to shrink. And so it will shrink away from what is wet and can cause it to crack. And sometimes it will crack down into the body of your pot. So it's better to just go ahead and release it from that extra edge before walking away. That way, you know that you have an even section on the mold that's drying. So now we leave that there for a while. For me, I have to leave them pretty much overnight here. Like I could pour it in the afternoon, and then like I poured this one yesterday evening, and I'm pretty sure I can get it out today. When it's ready, you can see a separation line in between the clay piece and the mold. So it looks like that shadow line like our tiles. Sometimes, if it is a tricky piece, sometimes I set it on my side. You remember us doing that with our tiles and kind of popping the tiles out. Sometimes I can just pull them out. I'm not in my normal workspace, so you'll forgive me if I mess something up. But I just kind of grabbed it out, pulled it out. So it has to be able to hold its own shape. A good way to know that it can hold its own shape is that it's lost its sheen. Remember, the clay is really shiny and glossy when it's super wet. So if you can easily touch it and see your fingerprint, or if it's at all glossy and reflective, it is probably too wet to take out of the mold, and you should just leave it. Here, this is definitely wetter than leather hard. So you could take these pieces out, and if you wrapped them up in plastic and I kept making them, then I could cut them apart and assemble them like I've been doing all this hand building stuff. So they come out just a little bit softer than leather hard, and that's good because if you want to attach anything to it, you still can, or if you want to cut into it, which is what I'm going to do here. So when it comes out of the mold, I know it's so hard for you guys to see, but the edges are very sharp. They're gross. When you cast your piece, you always think about maybe leaving like a little bit of extra at the top, just in case you have to trim your mold. You don't want to trim down into the form. So leaving a little bit of extra to trim down to the perfect shape is always a good idea. I'm a huge fan of trimming. This has kind of these stripes in it. This is one of the reasons this is cast, is because it has these lobes on the surface. And I could do that throwing. It would just take me a long time for every single bowl, and it probably wouldn't be even. But I like to highlight the lobes by cutting into it. So as soon as it comes out of the mold, there's a couple things that I'm going to do. First, I'm going to take my knife, and I am going to trim out some shapes. So down in between my lobes, where I have this little divot, I'm cutting out like a little U-shaped piece, and that's going to accentuate the sort of flowery or gourd-like appeal, I think. And so that was the pretty rough cut. And then I like to use my Sureform. So again, the cheese grater thing. And then I like to come around the edge. And then that takes off the sharpness off this outside edge where it's super thin. Wherever it touches the edge of the plaster at the top, it gets really, really thin. And then there's also always sort of like a little extra band of material around the inside. It seems to thicken right at the top more than others. And so on the other side of my knife tool is kind of like a needle tool. So I'm not cutting it because it'd be really easy to cut into the bowl someplace where I don't want it. But I am going to use the edge of that needle tool to just kind of knock off that raised edge. And I don't have to do this. I can do it with a sponge. It's just a ton faster to do it right now while the clay is kind of damp. Okay. So now I've gone around the inside. So I've cut my U-shaped pieces. I've trimmed off that outer corner, and I've knocked off the material off the inside edge. Now this pot has just come out of the mold. If I start going into this with a sponge right now, the clay will soften up, and it's really easy to deform these pots. These pots have not been under compression in any way. And so the particles, although uniform and maybe even large, are headed in a million different directions. And so as soon as you add water, water gets in between those particles and they loosen up and they soften and they can't hold their shape. So if I'm impatient, I will do some cleaning up right now. But sometimes when they just come out of the mold, it's easy to cut them. But I don't like to introduce water into the system. I like to wait until they're just a little bit stiffer. And so this is almost ready to change color, but it's been sitting out for a day. And then I'm going to just take my sponge and kind of clean off all of those marks. So let's say you get like a little mark inside of your mold. Some people will get like a weird bubble, maybe an air bubble, or something happens from the mold soap, or, you know, you have a little imperfection in the surface. Pretty much everything that comes out of our studio, out of these slip cast molds, is going to have to be cleaned up. You're making a design decision if you pop this piece out of the mold and put it into the kiln. Like you're making a decision about the finished quality of the piece. And so just assume that you're going to have to wipe basically every surface and every corner and every edge, including the bottom. So this is something that, you know, just kind of, it's just patience. So you do a lot of work planning for the mold to make the mold as nice as possible. And then, you know, you pour your slip in and out, and then you spend most of your time trimming and kind of cleaning up and making it nice. So I could cast this thick enough that I could carve texture on the outside. We saw some slides where people were doing different colored clay, so pouring different colored slips in and carving down through them. So there's a lot of ways to get some nice effects on your pieces. So this, I'm going all the way around, all of the edges, all the interior, the exterior, and this bottom corner. And then I'm going to sign the bottom of the piece and then let it dry out. So be careful about adding extra water. If you want to make a handle or an attachment for a slip cast piece, it has to also be a cast piece. So the clay that comes off of this that I trim off, we cannot reclaim. If you remember, there's a special formula to make slip float to keep it from settling out. It's impossible to kind of go back to that proper ratio. So all of these trimmings have to be thrown away. Do not put them back in the slip bucket. And these pots are fragile. So not only are they fragile if you add water to them, right now, if I was to really like pinch it, or if I was to pick it up by the rim, it's going to break really easily. So just be careful with them. They're more fragile than pots that have been under compression. So that one is cleaned up. And I did try and make the big one. So I had the two molds that we looked at the other day. I brought in the triangle mold. This one is still damp, so I haven't been able to cast it yet. It's just been so wet and rainy. And then I'll see if I can do this without tearing my phone off. Then, yeah, I also made, you remember the light fixture guy, and he's here, and he did dry out faster. He was a little bit thinner, and I haven't tried to take him out of the mold yet. I'm a little bit nervous. But I think I'm getting pretty close to what I wanted to show you. I poured the slip in, I poured the slip out, I pulled the pot out, and I cleaned off the edges. And then, yeah, I'd let it dry, I'd bisque fire it, and then we would glaze it. So I could try and pull this out. It could be a disaster. I'm not sure it's ready. But I want to know if you guys have any questions. So it's about 12. So I did good today, starting on time. So we have time for questions or any concerns. I'll give you a second to think about that. So next Tuesday, I'm hoping that we will gather again, and you all are so kind and patient listening to me every class. I would like to hear from you again. Remember, please bring, have available on your computer an image to share. So this can be something that is reflective of what you've learned in class. It could be something that you've made in class if you took pictures of it before spring break. It could be something that you've made since spring break. I guess it could even be non-ceramic if it was creative, or some interesting piece of research or something, yeah, that you want to investigate further. So each student would have about 2 minutes. So it's not like you're making a 10-minute research presentation. And I might also have you drop it on Canvas with a small reflection as a replacement for what would normally be a portfolio page to finish out the semester. So this is our replacement for that. Somebody asked me at the end of class last time about grading for this semester. And just remember, you can change your grade type all the way up to May 6th, but we have the projects before spring break. You have all been showing up to class, and I have your reflections from the end of class, which shows your attendance, and then this thing next Tuesday, this 2-minute, what do you love about pottery, or what else do you want to know? And that is how we will wrap up. So questions or concerns? Let's see, a couple questions. Does slip go bad? It doesn't. It just depends on whether or not it's changed moisture content. So like if it's in a plastic bag, that's how I get the slip for school, is I get it delivered as liquid slip, and it always kind of settles out in the bottom. So I just break up those chunks really, really well when I put it in the bucket. And then I check the consistency with my hands to see whether or not it's like pancake batter, or if it's, you know, if it starts to get thicker, like it can hold its own shape, like ranch dip or something like that, then that is too thick. So it depends on whether or not it's dried out totally. If it's gotten completely dry, that would be hard to reclaim. But if it's just a little bit thick, then you add just a teeny bit of water, like literally like a half a cup at a time, and mix it fully in, and then kind of bring it back into shape. Zach wants to know about mold biscuits, but that feels like an in-person thing. You mean like the little things that go on the bottom of the cups, or the biscuits that they're firing? So I use that term in 2 ways, and I'm sorry if that's confusing. One is I call a biscuit, which is the disc that goes inside of a cup mold that makes a negative space for the foot. I call that ring because it's in the shape of a biscuit. But the other thing that's in the shape of a biscuit is a small ceramic disc that you put your cup like on either the foot or the rim of it. Some people even leave the rim a little bit unglazed, just the very edge, so that the cups don't change shape. So the biscuit actually kind of holds the pots round, so it doesn't give them any room to wiggle while they're in the kiln. Okay, I noticed some mold on my clay the other day. That is totally normal. There's organic material in all of our clay. If you look at the clay that's in the studio now, because it's been sitting around unloved, it has little black spots on it. It's totally normal. It's organic material. It's actually good for it. It makes it plastic. So that means you can bend it without it breaking. We call clay without organic material short, because you can't pull it very long before it breaks. So organic material is good. Don't worry about it. Just, if it really freaks you out, you can scrape it off, but really you ought to just wedge it back in. Slip casted piece is noticeably weaker after firing than other methods. Not necessarily. Oh, they're only weaker. Slip cast pots are only weaker after firing if you poorly address the section in general. Like if it's just flat out too thin, it doesn't matter what kind of clay it is, you're gonna break it if you put it under enough pressure. It's really important to think about the edges. It's very easy to get a very thin edge on slip casting. And if the piece is too thin, it also won't hold glaze very well. So there's just like literally not enough material there with porosity to hold the glazes. And so you'll put the glaze on and it'll take like 20 minutes for it to dry as opposed to 30 seconds. Wedge with a new box. Okay. Yeah, distribute the mold. Good job. Okay. Any other questions or concerns, thoughts for today? No? Okay. Well, our normal thing, please, if you don't mind leaving me a little reflection on something that you learned today or thought was interesting or you have more questions about. And then we'll get back together next Tuesday and we'll have a little time to go around and bring some closure to the semester. And I invite my guests to come next Tuesday too and share their work so the students can see it. I don't know if this is going to come out, but I'm going to try while you guys are doing all of your reflections. So have a good day. And I think that's it. I'll talk to you next Tuesday.